My name is Albert, and this is the story of how my wife asked for a divorce, but somehow felt hurt by my response. When I look back now, with the clarity that only distance and time can provide, I realize the early cracks in our marriage were so small that I completely missed them. Or I saw them and chose to look away, convincing myself they were nothing more than the natural wear and tear of any long-term relationship. To me, we were just a married couple dealing with life stress and trying to balance the endless responsibilities that come with being adults in the modern world. I thought the quiet evenings after work were those of two people who had been together long enough that they didn't need to fill every silence with conversation. And I thought her short answers were just tiredness from her demanding job. I never imagined she was slowly pulling away while I stayed busy convincing myself everything was fine. I was so focused on maintaining what I thought was stability, keeping the house in order, and making sure we had everything we needed, that I failed to see she needed something I wasn't providing. Something I didn't even know was missing until it was too late. Our mornings followed a predictable pattern. We would have surface-level conversations that skimmed the surface of our lives without ever diving deeper. On weekends, we would do our separate things. We existed in parallel rather than together, but I never saw the harm in that. I rationalized it that we were two independent people who had chosen to share a life, not two people who needed to be joined at the hip. I prided myself on not being one of those clingy husbands who couldn't let their wives have their own interests and friendships. I gave her space and freedom. What I didn't realize was that she interpreted my giving her space as me not caring enough to invade it. She saw my comfort with silence as indifference. She mistook my stability for stagnation. And while I was congratulating myself on being a mature, secure husband, she was feeling increasingly invisible in her own marriage. These small failures accumulated like dust in the corners of our marriage, invisible day by day, but eventually forming a thick layer that dulled everything. And I, in my comfortable obliviousness, kept thinking we were fine. Gradually, she became more irritated, snapping at me over minor issues that had never bothered her before. Some harmless action suddenly triggers a disproportionate response. She would react sharply to innocent questions, her tone carrying an edge that seemed to come from nowhere. Or she would become distant for days without explaining why, retreating into herself and leaving me on the outside, wondering what I had done wrong, but too afraid to ask because I didn't want to make things worse. We were speaking different languages without realizing it, each of us doing what we thought was right, and both of us getting it completely wrong. Her irritability seemed to spike around certain times, after she had been on her phone for extended periods, after she had spent time with certain friends, after she had been consuming content online that I wasn't privy to. I would try to engage her in conversation, asking what was on her mind and why she was cold, but she would brush me off with vague statements like "I'm fine, just tired," or "a lot on my mind." I learned to stop asking because my questions seemed to annoy her more than help the situation. Her mood swings became more pronounced as time went on. It got to a point that I never knew which version of her I would encounter. I tried to read her mood before I spoke so I could adjust my approach accordingly. I began to notice that she was listening to people who constantly talked about independence, self-love, and not settling for a relationship that didn't feel whole. As she withdraws in the use of social media instead of speaking about what is actually wrong, I would catch glimpses of the content she was engaging with, posts about women who had left comfortable but unfulfilling relationships, articles about recognizing when you're not being valued, videos of influencers talking about how you deserve a partner who makes you feel like the center of the universe every single day. She was in an echo chamber that validated every doubt she had about our marriage, while offering no perspective on the value of stability, commitment, or working through difficult periods. During arguments over minor misunderstandings, she began comparing our simple life to a fantasy she had seen online that never truly existed. She would mention couples who were constantly traveling to exotic locations, who posted elaborate date nights and grand romantic gestures, who seemed to be living in a constant state of passion and excitement. She would look at our quiet evenings at home, our practical approach to finances, and our routine-based life, and find them lacking compared to the carefully curated highlight reels she was consuming daily. Why don't we ever do anything exciting? She would ask, and I would point out that we had responsibilities, that we were saving for our future, that we couldn't just drop everything and fly to Paris on a whim. But my practical responses only seemed to frustrate her more. She didn't want practical. She wanted magic. She wanted to feel like she was living in one of those posts she saw every day, where everything was beautiful, romantic, and effortlessly perfect. I tried to explain that what she was seeing online wasn't real, that those couples were showing only the best moments of their lives, that everyone's day-to-day existence was filled with mundane tasks, quiet evenings, and routine. But she didn't want to hear it. Or maybe she couldn't hear it, because the alternative narrative was so much more appealing. It's easier to believe that there's something better out there, that you're missing out on some grand adventure, than to accept that this is what life actually looks like for most people most of the time. Suddenly, our steady, quiet marriage felt boring to her, even though I thought we both valued stability. I had believed we were on the same page about building a solid foundation for our future, about prioritizing security and partnership over excitement and passion. But somewhere along the way, she had changed the script without telling me. The things I thought were strengths of our relationship had become weaknesses in her eyes. We were too predictable, too stable, too boring. I watched helplessly as she became increasingly dissatisfied with a life that I thought was pretty good. We had a lovely home. We both had decent jobs. We were healthy. We had friends and family. We weren't rich, but we weren't struggling. We had built something solid together. But none of that seemed to matter anymore, because it didn't match the fantasy she was being sold every time she opened her phone. The outside influences weren't just affecting her view of our marriage. They were affecting her view of herself. She started talking about finding herself, discovering what she really wants, and not losing her identity in a relationship. These are all valid concerns, and I tried to be supportive. I encouraged her to pursue her interests, to spend time with friends, to do things that made her happy. But nothing I did seemed enough, because the problem wasn't actually about her having freedom, space, or the opportunity to be herself. The problem was that she had started to believe that being married to me was preventing her from becoming whomever she thought she was supposed to be. What hurt the most was that she couldn't see how these outside influences were distorting her perception. She thought she was having some awakening, that she was finally seeing our marriage clearly for the first time. But from my perspective, she was seeing it through a funhouse mirror that made everything look wrong. I didn't know how to compete with the fantasy world she was comparing us to, because that world didn't exist. One evening, after months of increasing tension and distance, she looked at me with a tired expression that I had never seen before and said, "I don't feel loved anymore in this house." Aside from arguments and fights, this was the first time she had directly expressed herself. However, her words were still vague as I tried to understand how we had gotten to this point and to figure out what I was supposed to say or do in response to such a devastating statement. When I finally found my voice, I asked what I was doing wrong. I needed specifics, concrete examples of my failures so that I could fix them. But she couldn't give me specific answers. She just said she felt lonely and unseen. She said it was like living with a roommate rather than a husband. She said she couldn't remember the last time I had really looked at her, really talked to her, really made her feel like she mattered. Her words were vague and emotional, and I struggled to translate them into actionable items. How do you help someone who feels unseen? What does that even mean in practical terms? I apologized immediately and told her I wanted to do better. I meant it, and I really did. The thought that I had been making her feel unloved was genuinely painful to me. I had never intended to hurt her or make her feel neglected. But I was lost. I didn't know how to fix something that she couldn't clearly explain. It was like she was speaking a language I didn't understand, describing problems I couldn't see, asking for solutions to issues I didn't know existed. "What do you need from me?" I asked, desperate for guidance, for a roadmap showing me how to save our marriage. But she just shook her head and said, "I shouldn't have to tell you. You should know." And that response, more than anything else she said that night, made me realize how far apart we had drifted. Because I didn't know. I had no idea what she needed, wanted, or expected from me. And apparently, the fact that I didn't instinctively know was itself part of the problem. We talked for hours that night, going in circles, with her trying to express feelings she couldn't quite articulate, and me trying to understand problems I couldn't quite grasp. She talked about feeling like she wasn't a priority, like I was going through the motions of being married without actually being present. She said she felt like I had stopped trying, like I had gotten comfortable and stopped putting in effort. And maybe she was right. I may have gotten comfortable. I may have stopped doing the little things that mattered in the beginning. But I had thought that was normal, that it was okay to relax into a relationship once you were married, that you didn't have to keep courting someone who had already committed to you. I asked her if there was someone else, and she looked genuinely offended by the question. This isn't about someone else, she said. This is about us. About how you make me feel, or don't make me feel. I believed her, but part of me almost wished there was someone else, because at least then I would understand the problem. At least then there would be a clear villain, an apparent reason for her unhappiness. But this was more complicated and more painful, because the villain was apparently me, or at least my inadequacy as a husband. By the end of that conversation, I felt like I had been hollowed out. She went to bed, and I sat alone in the living room, replaying everything she had said, trying to figure out where I had gone wrong. But even as I acknowledged relaxing on some of the things I was doing, part of me felt frustrated and confused because I had been trying. Maybe not in the way she needed, but I had been showing up, providing, being faithful, being present in the ways I knew how. I wasn't perfect, but I wasn't a bad husband. I hadn't cheated or lied or abused her. I had just been ordinary. And apparently, that wasn't enough. That night marked a turning point for me. I realized our marriage was in serious trouble, that we were on a path that could lead to its end if something didn't change. I resolved to do better, to be more attentive, to show her more affection, to make her feel valued and loved. After that conversation, I started doing more. I cooked more, tried to work less, asked her questions more, but instead of things getting better as I had hoped, she gradually grew even more distant. It was as if finally voicing her unhappiness had given her permission to disengage entirely. Any form of intimacy that had been on life support vanished during this time. She would make excuses when I initiated anything more intimate. Our physical relationship, which had already been struggling, died completely. It was like she became more relaxed after asking me to put in more effort. She would come home late and say she was just tired, but I could tell there was more to it than that. When she was home, she would retreat to another room, claiming she needed some quiet time. We were living in the same house, but existing in entirely separate worlds. I could feel her slipping away, but I didn't know how to pull her back. I put in more effort than I could have thought of. I planned a date night, but she seemed to go through the motions without any genuine enthusiasm. I bought her flowers, but she thanked me with a polite smile that didn't reach her eyes. I tried to initiate deeper conversations, but she would give me surface-level responses and then find a reason to end the conversation. It was like trying to hold onto water. The tighter I tried to grip, the faster she slipped through my fingers. I didn't want to push her into an argument or make things worse by being demanding or confrontational. I watched her become a stranger. The loneliness of that period was profound. I was living with someone but feeling completely alone. One quiet Saturday morning, while I was having my morning coffee and scrolling through the news on my phone, she came to me and said, almost casually, I want a divorce. At first, I thought I misheard her. My brain couldn't process that she had actually said those words, that this was actually happening. I looked up from my phone, searching her face for any sign that she was joking, being dramatic, or testing me. But when I looked at her face, I realized she wasn't joking. She had made this decision long before she spoke it. This was a planned announcement, something she had been building up to, probably for weeks or even months. While I had been hoping things would get better, hoping we would find our way back to each other, she had been planning her exit. My heart sank, dropping into my stomach, but I stayed calm. Not because I didn't care, I cared more than I could express, but because I suddenly understood that her emotional baggage had been packed for months. She had already left our marriage in every way except physically. This announcement made official what had already happened in her heart. She had been living as a single woman in her mind for who knows how long, and I had been the only one still trying to make our marriage work after our last conversation. I set down my coffee cup carefully, buying myself a few seconds to think, to process, to figure out how to respond. 1,000 thoughts raced through my mind. Should I fight? Should I beg? Should I ask her to reconsider? Should I demand couples therapy? Should I break down and show her how much this was destroying me? But underneath all those questions was a more profound realization. She had already made up her mind. This wasn't the beginning of a conversation about whether we should divorce. This was the end of a conversation she had been having with herself for months. "Are you sure?" I asked, my voice surprisingly steady. "Is this really what you want?" She nodded. "I've been thinking about this for a long time," she said. "I'm not happy. I haven't been happy for a while. And I don't think that's going to change." I wanted to argue with her, to point out that happiness isn't constant, that all marriages go through difficult periods, that we had made vows to each other that meant something. But I also knew that you can't logic someone into loving you. You can't convince someone to stay in a marriage they've already left emotionally. And I was tired of walking on eggshells. Tired of trying to decode her moods. Tired of feeling like I was failing at something I didn't know how to succeed at. Instead of arguing, I said, "If you're this unhappy, I won't force you to stay." I was done being the only one who wanted this to work. If she wanted out, if she was this miserable, then letting her go was the kindest thing I could do for both of us. When she heard my calm voice, her expression changed. It seemed like she didn't expect peace. She expected a battle. She expected me to fight, to argue, to refuse to accept her decision. "That's it?" she asked, her voice rising slightly. "You're just okay with this?" I looked at her and said, "I'm not okay with it. But I'm not going to beg you to stay in a marriage you don't want. I'm not going to force you to be with someone who makes you this unhappy. If you've made up your mind, then we should move forward with what you want." The irony wasn't lost on me. For months, she had been complaining that I didn't fight for her, that I didn't show enough emotion, that I was too passive. And now, when I was being passive in the face of her divorce request, she seemed upset by it. But I wasn't being passive out of indifference. I was being accepting out of respect. Respect for her decision, respect for her autonomy, and respect for myself enough not to grovel for someone who had already decided I wasn't enough. Over the next few days, her certainty seemed to waver. She started trying to engage me in conversations about why our marriage had failed, seemingly wanting me to take all the blame, to confirm her narrative that I was the problem. But I refused to play that game. I acknowledged my failures, but I also pointed out that she had checked out, stopped communicating, and made this decision without really giving me a chance to fix things. "You never told me what you needed," I said during one of these conversations. "You expected me just to know, and when I didn't, you held it against me. You pulled away and then blamed me for not chasing you. You made up your mind about our marriage and then announced it as a done deal. So yes, I failed you in many ways. But you failed me, too. You failed to communicate. You failed to give me a real chance to change. You failed to fight for us before deciding to leave." My words seemed to shake something loose in her. She started crying, which I hadn't seen her do in months. But that didn't change anything. Within days of her announcement, I heard from friends and family that she had told everyone I didn't fight for her, that I didn't love her, that I had agreed too fast to the divorce. She was crafting a narrative in which she was the victim of my indifference, forced to leave because I simply didn't care enough to keep her. In her version of events, she was the long-suffering wife who had finally reached her breaking point with a husband who couldn't be bothered to show her love. But when people spoke to me, they saw a different picture. They saw a man who had tried quietly for years and respected her choice, even when it broke him. A man who refused to turn a painful moment into a war. My friends who knew us both started asking questions, noticed inconsistencies in her story, and realized that maybe the situation was more complicated than she was making it seem. I didn't badmouth her to anyone. I didn't try to turn people against her or make her look like the villain. When people asked what happened, I said that we had grown apart, that we wanted different things, that sometimes love isn't enough. I took responsibility for my part in our marriage failing, without throwing her under the bus for hers. But my dignity in the face of her accusations spoke louder than any defense I could have mounted. Some of her friends reached out to me, surprisingly, saying they had watched her become increasingly dissatisfied over the past year, that they had tried to encourage her to communicate with me rather than just complaining to them, and that they thought she was making a mistake. They told me about conversations where she had talked about our marriage in ways that didn't match reality, where she had exaggerated problems or misrepresented situations to make herself look more sympathetic. They told me she had been building a case against me for months, collecting grievances and interpreting everything I did in the worst possible light. My own family was supportive, but also confused. They had thought we were happy. They had seen us at family gatherings where we seemed fine, where we functioned well together, where there was no obvious sign of the turmoil brewing beneath the surface. My mother asked me if there was someone else, if there was something I wasn't telling them. But I honestly didn't think there was anyone else. I think the someone else was the fantasy life she had convinced herself she was missing out on. The excitement and passion and romance that she felt she deserved, but that our ordinary marriage couldn't provide. I insisted we proceed with the divorce since she asked for it. I wasn't going to drag it out, make it difficult, or use it as leverage to try to win her back. She wanted out, and I was going to give her what she wanted. We hired lawyers, divided our assets, and went through the painful process of untangling our lives. Through it all, I remained calm and fair, not trying to punish her or make her suffer, just trying to get through it. After the whole divorce process, which took months of lawyers, paperwork, and awkward exchanges over belongings, she finally left. She moved out on a Tuesday afternoon while I was at work, which I appreciated because I don't think I could have watched her pack up her life and walk out the door. I came home to a house that was noticeably emptier. Half the furniture gone, gaps on the bookshelves, empty spaces on the walls where pictures used to hang. The silence was deafening. I started therapy, something I probably should have done months earlier. My therapist helped me process the grief of losing not just my wife, but the future I had imagined we would have together. She helped me see that my worth wasn't determined by my ability to make someone else happy, especially someone who had decided to be unhappy. I joined a gym, partly because I needed something to do with all the time I suddenly had, and partly because I needed to feel strong in some area of my life when I felt so weak emotionally. There was something satisfying about pushing my body to its limits, about having concrete goals I could achieve, about seeing measurable progress. I reconnected with old friends I used to hang out with regularly, but had drifted away from as I focused on building a life with my wife. They reminded me that I had an identity beyond being a husband, that I was a person with interests, hobbies, and values beyond my relationship status. I did all these things to keep my mind busy and pass through the separation stage without breaking down. There were hard days when I would see something that reminded me of her, or days when the loneliness felt overwhelming, or days when I questioned whether I had given up too easily. But gradually, I began to have space to figure out who I was as a single man after years of defining myself as part of a couple. Looking back now, with a clarity that comes from distance and healing, I don't blame her for wanting more. Everyone deserves to feel loved, valued, and seen in their relationship. Everyone deserves passion, excitement, and romance. I don't fault her for realizing that our marriage wasn't giving her what she needed. What I do fault her for is the way she handled it, the silent withdrawal, the refusal to communicate clearly, the expectation that I should know what she needed without her telling me, the final test of asking for a divorce to see if I would fight for her. I don't blame myself for not knowing how to give her what she needed when she couldn't articulate what that was. I don't blame myself for being steady and reliable instead of passionate and exciting. I don't blame myself for building a life focused on stability rather than adventure. Those aren't character flaws, they're just different priorities, different love languages, different ways of showing care. They weren't wrong. They just weren't what she wanted. Sometimes two good people stop being good for each other. Sometimes love doesn't die suddenly in a dramatic explosion. It just fades slowly, like a photograph left in the sun, until one person finally says out loud what both have felt deep inside. We had become incompatible, wanting different things from life and from each other, speaking different languages, and unable to find a translator. I've learned a lot from this experience. I've learned that communication is more critical than I ever realized, that you can't assume your partner knows what you're thinking or feeling, and that you have to be explicit about your needs and expectations. I've learned that stability isn't enough on its own because relationships need attention, effort, and intentionality even after you're married. I've learned that you can't save a marriage alone, that it takes two people committed to working through problems together. But I've also learned that I'm stronger than I thought I was, that I can survive heartbreak and come out the other side, that my worth isn't determined by whether someone chooses to stay with me, that I have value and qualities that the right person will appreciate, that being ordinary isn't a failure, it's just being human. I don't know what the future holds. I'll find someone who values what I have to offer, who speaks the same language I do, and who wants the same kind of life I do. I'll be alone for a while and learn to be okay with that. I'll look back on this marriage as a painful but necessary chapter in my life that taught me important lessons about myself and about love. Thanks for watching.